The moment they sense the loss of control is not dramatic on the surface. There is no announcement, no confession, no sudden moment of insight where they say, I see what I've done. Instead, it is subtle. It begins when your energy changes, when you stop over-explaining, when you stop defending yourself against accusations that were never rooted in reality. When you stop chasing clarity from someone who thrives on confusion, that is when the shift begins. In narcissistic dynamics, control is not always loud or obvious. It can look like constant criticism that slowly erodes your confidence. It can look like unpredictable affection that keeps you hooked. It can look like silent treatment that makes you anxious enough to apologize for things you didn't do. Control in these relationships is psychological. It is emotional. It is about keeping you slightly off balance so that they remain the emotional center of gravity. For a long time, you may not even realize you are participating in this system. You think you are just trying to fix things, to communicate better, to be more understanding. You may believe that if you explain yourself clearly enough, if you love deeply enough, if you stay patient enough, the chaos will settle. But what you are actually doing is feeding the dynamic. Every reaction, every tear, every argument is proof that they still matter, that they still have access to your emotional world. The moment they sense they no longer have that access is the moment everything shifts. It might be the first time you calmly say, I'm not discussing this anymore. It might be when you stop responding to baiting messages. It might be when you no longer react to insults designed to provoke you. It might be when you go no contact or when your responses become neutral and brief. Whatever form it takes, the underlying message is the same. You are no longer available for emotional manipulation. And they feel it immediately. Narcissistic personalities are highly attuned to changes in supply. They may not be emotionally empathetic, but they are strategically perceptive. They notice when your tone changes, when your eyes no longer search theirs for reassurance, when you no longer scramble to fix their moods. The absence of your emotional reactivity creates a vacuum, and that vacuum is destabilizing. At first, they may test it. They might escalate their behavior to see if they can provoke you back into your old patterns. The criticism may get sharper, the accusations more outrageous. The charm more exaggerated. This is not random. It is a stress response. They are attempting to regain control of a system that is slipping away. If you react strongly, the system resets. If you stay calm, the loss becomes undeniable. What makes this moment so powerful is that it is not fueled by anger. It is fueled by clarity. When you detach emotionally, it is usually because you have reached a threshold. You have seen the pattern too many times. You have recognized that the apologies are cyclical, that the promises are temporary, that the blame always circles back to you. Emotional detachment is rarely impulsive. It is often the result of deep exhaustion and hard-earned awareness. From their perspective, your detachment can feel like abandonment. But it is important to understand the difference between abandonment and boundaries. Abandonment is leaving someone who depends on you in a healthy way. Boundaries are stepping away from someone who depends on controlling you. When you establish boundaries, you disrupt the power imbalance. And for someone who relies on that imbalance, it feels like a profound loss. They may respond with confusion. Why are you being cold? You've changed. You don't care anymore. Notice how the focus is not on their behavior. It is on your reaction, because the loss of control is not about losing love. It is about losing influence. When they can no longer dictate the emotional temperature of the relationship, they experience a narcissistic injury, a wound to their ego structure. This is often the point where you might feel tempted to explain yourself again. to soften the boundary, to reassure them. But every time you over-explain, you reopen the door. Control thrives on access. When you remain steady, when you accept that they may never understand your boundary, you reinforce your autonomy. The moment they sense the loss of control is not just a turning point for them, it is a turning point for you. It is the first tangible evidence that you are no longer operating from fear, guilt, or obligation. You are operating from self-respect. And self-respect is something they cannot manipulate. That is when the power dynamic truly begins to collapse, not because you fought harder, but because you stopped playing. The shift from grandiosity to panic is rarely visible in a straightforward way. On the surface, they may still appear composed, confident, even dismissive. They may act as though your detachment doesn't affect them at all. In fact, they may amplify their superiority. They might brag more, criticize more, showcase their success more publicly, but internally, something very destabilizing is happening. Because grandiosity in narcissism is not genuine confidence. It is a defense against deep insecurity. And when you withdraw your emotional participation, you weaken that defense. Grandiosity functions like armor. It protects a fragile internal structure that cannot tolerate shame, rejection, or insignificance. As long as you were reacting, arguing, pleading, trying, fixing, you were reinforcing their sense of importance. Even your frustration confirmed that they mattered deeply in your emotional world. But when you step back and become emotionally neutral, that mirror disappears. And without that mirror, their inflated self-image starts to crack. This is where panic sets in, not always conscious panic, not always something they can articulate, but a psychological destabilization. Narcissistic personalities rely heavily on external validation to regulate their self-esteem. They do not have a stable internal sense of worth. Their identity is constructed through admiration, control, and emotional dominance. When one of their primary sources of validation detaches, it creates a kind of ego free fall. They may initially respond with denial. I don't care. I'm better off. You were the problem anyway. This is protective bravado, but beneath it, there is often anxiety. Who are they without your attention? Without your emotional labor, without the ability to trigger you, the loss is not just relational, it is structural. You were part of the scaffolding holding up their self-concept. As the panic grows, their behavior can become erratic. They may swing between extremes. One moment cold and dismissive, the next moment overly affectionate or nostalgic. This emotional volatility is not about love. It is about regulation. They are trying to stabilize themselves by reestablishing control. If they can pull you back into the dynamic, even through conflict, they can soothe the panic temporarily. What is important to understand is that this panic often feels like humiliation to them. Narcissistic individuals are hypersensitive to perceived rejection. Your calm withdrawal can feel like exposure, like you have seen through the illusion, and nothing threatens grandiosity more than exposure. When they sense that you are no longer buying into the narrative, that you are no longer intimidated, impressed, or emotionally dependent, it challenges the core defense mechanism they rely on. This is also when comparison behavior may intensify. They may quickly attach to someone new and showcase that relationship publicly. They may emphasize how happy they are, how successful they are, how unbothered they are. This is not necessarily because they have moved on in a healthy way. It is often a strategy to counteract the internal panic. If they can prove to you, to others, to themselves that they are still desirable and powerful, they can patch the crack in the armor. But grandiosity built on external supply is unstable. It requires constant reinforcement. And when you are part of that reinforcement system, your absence creates a deficit. Panic can manifest as anger, impulsive decisions, reckless behavior, or sudden attempts at self-improvement that are more performative than genuine. The underlying driver is the same: restore equilibrium, restore admiration, restore control. For you witnessing this shift can be confusing. You may see them thriving publicly and question your decision. You may wonder if they truly never cared, but remember, narcissistic panic does not always look like suffering. Sometimes it looks like overcompensation. Sometimes it looks like exaggerated happiness. Sometimes it looks like indifference. What matters is not the performance, it is the pattern. When grandiosity gives way to panic, you are seeing the fragility beneath the facade, and this is not something you need to fix, soothe, or respond to. In the past, you may have rushed in when they seemed distressed. You may have tried to reassure, to stabilize, to support, but that caretaking role is part of the old dynamic. When you step out of it, you allow the consequences of their emotional structure to belong to them. The shift from grandiosity to panic is one of the clearest signs that the power balance has changed. They can no longer rely on automatic access to your validation. They can no longer assume you will cushion their ego, and while that may intensify their behavior temporarily, it ultimately confirms something critical. Your detachment has impact, not because you are trying to hurt them, not because you are playing games, but because you have removed yourself from a system that depended on your emotional energy. And when the armor starts to crack, it reveals just how much that energy was holding together. That realization for them is destabilizing. And for you, it is confirmation that you are no longer under the spell of grandiosity. The hoovering and image repair tactics often begin the moment they recognize that their usual strategies are no longer working. When control slips and panic sets in, the next logical move for someone operating within a narcissistic framework is to try to reestablish access. Hoovering is not random. It is calculated even when it appears emotional or impulsive. It is designed to pull you back into the orbit of the relationship so the previous power structure can be restored. Hoovering can take many forms. It might look like a heartfelt apology that sounds more sincere than anything you've heard before. It might come as a late-night message filled with nostalgia, reminding you of the good times. It might show up as a crisis, sudden illness, financial problems, emotional breakdown that positions them as vulnerable and in need of your support. Sometimes it is subtle, liking old photos, casual check-ins, asking about practical matters that could easily be handled without you. The common thread is access. They are testing the door to see if it is still unlocked. What makes hoovering powerful is that it often targets your empathy. If you were in a relationship with a narcissistic person, chances are you are empathetic, reflective, and willing to work on problems. Hoovering exploits those strengths. The apology may include just enough accountability to feel real, but not enough to demonstrate genuine insight. You might hear phrases like, "I've been thinking a lot," or "I realize I made mistakes." But when you look closely, the accountability is vague. There is no sustained pattern of change, just a temporary performance designed to re-engage you emotionally. At the same time, image repair may be happening in the background. When they sense they are losing you or have lost you, they may attempt to control the narrative. This can happen socially, professionally, even within family systems. They may portray themselves as misunderstood, heartbroken, or blindsided. They may suggest that you were unstable, overly sensitive, or ungrateful. This is not simply about reputation. It is about preserving their self-concept. If they can convince others and themselves that they were not at fault, they protect their fragile ego from shame. In some cases, hoovering and image repair happen simultaneously. You might receive warm, affectionate messages privately while hearing that they are telling others a completely different story about you. This duality can be disorienting. It is meant to be. Confusion keeps you engaged. If you are trying to reconcile conflicting narratives, you are still emotionally invested. And emotional investment, even in the form of distress, feeds the dynamic. It is important to understand that hoovering is not always conscious manipulation in the villainous sense people imagine. Often, it is a deeply ingrained survival strategy. Narcissistic individuals struggle with object constancy, the ability to maintain a stable emotional connection to someone who is not actively validating them. When you detach, they experience that absence as a threat. Hoovering becomes a way to relieve that anxiety. But relief for them would mean re-entering a cycle that was harmful to you. You may feel tempted to respond for closure. You may want to believe the change is real. And sometimes people can grow, but growth is consistent, uncomfortable, and sustained over time. It is not dramatic declarations followed by the same old patterns. If the outreach is followed by pressure, guilt, or subtle blame, that is not transformation. That is a strategy. If hoovering fails, if hoovering fails. If you do not respond, if you remain steady in your boundaries, they may intensify efforts to shape how others see you. This is where smear campaigns can emerge. Half-truths, selective storytelling, omitted context. The goal is to regain a sense of superiority and to avoid facing the internal discomfort of rejection. If they can position you as the problem, they never have to confront their own behavior. What makes this stage particularly challenging is that it can trigger your need to defend yourself. You may want to correct every lie, explain every detail, set the record straight. And while there are situations where clarification is necessary, constantly fighting to control the narrative can pull you back into the very dynamic you are trying to leave. Not everyone needs to understand your experience for it to be valid. When a narcissist realizes you've won hoovering and image repair, are attempts to rewrite the ending. They are efforts to regain emotional supply and stabilize a shaken ego. But your power lies in consistency, in recognizing the pattern rather than reacting to the performance, in understanding that temporary intensity does not equal genuine change. The more grounded you remain, the clearer the tactics become. And the clearer they become, the less effective they are, because hoovering only works if the emotional hook is still embedded. When you remove the hook, when you no longer feel responsible for their feelings, their image, or their self-esteem, the attempts lose momentum. And that is when the cycle truly begins to break. When hoovering no longer works, when the apologies fail to pull you back in, when the nostalgia does not soften you, and when your silence remains steady, something much darker can emerge. Silent rage and the smear campaign. This stage is not always loud. In fact, it is often calculated, controlled, and strategic. But beneath that control is anger, not the healthy anger that comes from hurt, but a defensive rage rooted in wounded ego. Silent rage is exactly what it sounds like. It is anger that simmers beneath the surface. You may not see explosive outbursts. Instead, you may feel coldness, indifference, a sudden emotional cutoff. They may act as though you never mattered, as though the entire relationship was insignificant. This emotional withdrawal is not peace. It is punishment. It is an attempt to regain power by withholding acknowledgement. For someone operating from a narcissistic structure, being emotionally dethroned is intolerable. When you detach, when you stop engaging, when you refuse to fight for a seat at the table they once controlled, it creates what is known as a narcissistic injury. That injury feels like humiliation, exposure, rejectio. And rather than process those feelings internally, they externalize them. That externalization often takes the form of narrative control. The smear campaign is not random gossip. It is a strategic rewriting of history. They may begin telling others a version of events that casts them as the victim and you as unstable, ungrateful, or cruel. They may omit their behavior entirely. They may exaggerate your reactions while minimizing their actions. The goal is simple. If they can control how others see you, they can preserve how they see themselves. This is about shame avoidance. Shame is deeply threatening to narcissistic personalities. It is not processed in a reflective way. It is expelled, projected. If they feel small, they must make you look smaller. If they feel exposed, they must discredit the person who saw behind the curtain. And if you were the one who walked away, they may frame it as abandonment, betrayal, or emotional instability on your part. What makes this stage particularly destabilizing is that it can feel deeply unfair. You may hear about things being said that are distorted or entirely fabricated. Mutual friends may pull away, family members may question you, colleagues may shift their tone. The instinct to defend yourself can become overwhelming, and that instinct is understandable. You want the truth to be known, but here is what is critical to understand. Engaging aggressively in the smear campaign often feeds it. When you react publicly with anger, it can be used as further evidence against you. The narrative may shift to, "See, this is what I've been dealing with." The more emotionally charged the response, the more it reinforces the image they are attempting to construct. Silent rage also manifests in subtler ways. Passive-aggressive comments, withholding important information, deliberate exclusion. These behaviors are designed to provoke you into reaction because reaction equals relevance. If you are still reacting strongly, then they still matter in your emotional landscape, and that restores a sense of power. The hardest part of this phase is accepting that you cannot control what they say about you. You cannot force insight. You cannot force accountability. And trying to manage every conversation happening behind your back can drain you back into the same cycle you worked so hard to exit. True stability in this phase comes from anchoring yourself in your own reality. You know what you experienced. You know the patterns. You know the cycles. Gaslighting may have distorted your perception in the past, but your detachment was not impulsive. It was informed. It was the result of repeated evidence. Over time, something important happens. People who are grounded and observant begin to notice inconsistencies. Patterns reveal themselves. Narcissistic behavior is rarely isolated. If they are smearing you, chances are they have smeared others before. If they are positioning themselves as perpetual victims, that storyline eventually becomes familiar. Silent rage cannot sustain itself indefinitely without supply. Smear campaigns lose momentum when there is no dramatic counterattack. When you remain composed, when you do not retaliate publicly, when you continue living your life with integrity, the contrast becomes visible. And here is the deeper truth. Silent rage and smear campaigns are signs of loss. They are not signs of power. They are defensive maneuvers from someone who feels their control slipping permanently. Healthy individuals process breakups, conflicts, and endings with reflection. Narcissistic structures process them with projection and retaliation. When a narcissist realizes you've won and their attempts to regain access have failed, silent rage is often the last attempt to reassert dominance. But dominance requires participation. It requires your engagement. When you refuse to provide it, when you stay grounded and focused on rebuilding your own life, the campaign eventually collapses under its own weight. Because control without access is unsustainable. And when you no longer offer access emotionally, mentally, or socially, the rage has nowhere left to go.